Tonight on the Guy at the Movies podcast, we have a very special guest with us, Sean O'Connell from CinemaBlend, to talk about his new book, With Great Power. Tune in right after this.
Everyone is part of the family at this point.
It didn't do my fan fiction idea that I had, so this movie was garbage.
What is this? You are a monster beyond all belief.
Put them all in the thing and let them do the thing, you know what I mean?
How? You're lucky to have me back.
You're never gonna get 60 million people because you're not a Super Bowl. Shut up!
So chaotic.
Welcome to the Guy at the Movies podcast. Once again, very happy to be joined by Sean O'Connell, managing editor of CinemaBlend, and for our purposes today, author of 2 best-selling books at this point. Sean, how are you doing?
I'm great, man. Good to be back on the show. I appreciate you having me.
Yeah, very happy to chat with you. Of course, last time we were talking about Release the Snyder Cut, and you had shared at the end of that conversation that you had the itch and some ideas to start going another direction. And, you know, we're here to talk about where that direction took you with Great Power, how Spider-Man conquered Hollywood during the golden age of comic book blockbusters. But first and foremost, how are you doing? How are the holidays so far? We're in the middle of, you know, the holiday tease with Thanksgiving and then the big December ones popping up.
Yeah, it's been busy. You know, anyone who sort of covers the film industry, this time of year tends to become pretty hectic. Not just because of like the big movies that are coming to the theaters, things like Black Panther or the upcoming Avatar, but like a lot of awards contenders start to screen. And, you know, you and I were joking just before coming on here about how your emotions pivot from like really heavy, serious movies to something as goofy as like Violent Night that's out there. So we're just trying to fit in as much stuff as we can. Because also we do these year-end lists, and you want to make sure that you get to like as many of the cool movies that you've heard about as possible, even going all the way back to like the beginning of the year. So I feel like I'm on a nonstop binge of new films right about now, but that's okay. That's a good way to end the year.
Yeah, it's a fun way to end the year. It's funny, there's just not enough time to fit it all in, which is insane. Speaking of end of year lists, today was Spotify end of year list day. Did you get yours?
I saw those going around, but I haven't looked at mine yet. Like that kind of unwrapped thing that I have to do.
It's everywhere. It's absolutely everywhere on social media today.
I will do it eventually. Yes, I'm sure.
There you go. All right, Sean, let's talk about the book. It's absolutely engrossing, highly detailed, and touches on a lot of, I think, behind the scenes stories that people may have heard a bit about, but didn't necessarily know what really was going on. Why, after Release the Snyder Cut, after the success of that, why Spider-Man? What drew you towards that story?
Well, first off, thank you for checking the book out. I really appreciate it, because I really wanted to write it for fans of the character and of these movies in particular. Why Spider-Man is because I kind of learned, like a big takeaway that I got from the Snyder Cut book was that if you're going to really dedicate the time and energy that it takes to putting a book together, something I was extremely naive about going into the first book, is that it has to be about a subject that you love, because you're just going to be immersed in it. You know, you're going to be essentially researching it, writing it in all of your free time, constantly going back and editing it. And so if it's not something that you're invested in, then it's not worth the time and effort. Or I feel personally, it's not going to reflect well in the work that you're putting out there. And I love Spider-Man. He's been my favorite character since I was a little kid. And professionally, being able to cover the film industry, I kind of hit in 1999 and started working full-time in this industry. And then, of course, Raimi hit with 2002. So we've almost been like parallel. I've been able to cover all those films professionally. And as I sort of climbed the ladder, get myself to a position where I was able to cover the Amazing Spider-Man films a little bit more in depth, and then getting into the Marvel films, being able to go to some of the sets of those movies. And so I just realized that I had this kind of, you know, wealth of background information that if I wanted to sort of pour them into some of these stories that I single out in the book, I thought I had a unique way to sort of get into them. And so I thought, as like a Spider-Man fan, as somebody who loves the movies and adores the characters, like what are the touchstone moments over the course of his Hollywood journey, and what are the stories that I would love to get more details about? And so that's kind of how I carved out the structure of the book, and then just went about researching them.
That's great. And there are some incredible pictures that you contribute from on set. I think it was a family member that was with Andrew Garfield in one of the pictures.
Yeah,
Some really
my oldest son got to come to New York City with me for the Amazing Spider-Man 2. That was for 2.
I think it was
and
too.
Sony's gimmick for it was that they wanted kids to come and interview the cast. So this is certain journalists. They were like, if you have a kid who's of age and wants to do it, bring them by. And of course, my son sort of was, absorbing my love for Spider-Man at that time. And so he got to interview Andrew Garfield, Emma Stone, Jamie Foxx. Like, it was such an incredible opportunity.
Yeah, that's incredible. And the love that you have for the character certainly shines through the book. Want to ask a few specific questions just about some of the stuff in there. You obviously start with origins of the character. There's a long history of Spider-Man even before we saw him on the big screen. And then you get into tackling Sam Raimi's trilogy. And in discussing that, I found the sequel chapter to be absolutely fascinating and really my favorite part of the book. Because first we're learning that David Koepp, who would go on to, write or have contribute a lot to the Amazing Spider-Man, some of those elements were pitched for Spider-Man 3, I believe it was, if I'm not mistaken. And then we find out as well that Raimi absolutely hated Venom, didn't really want to see the suit options, whether it was going to be CGI or whatnot. Can you just talk a bit about the Spider-Man sequel issue that we seem to have overcome a little bit when it comes to the current iteration, but the first two goes at it really had some struggles?
Well, there'll be some people who argue that they haven't solved that problem. They'll complain about some of the MCU Spider-Man sequels, and there's a debate now whether Far From Home is the worst Spider-Man movie of all time, like worse than Spider-Man 3. So fan opinion, of course, changes all over the place. And that's something that I found really interesting with the Raimi sequels, is that they were facing something that no one had to face before, but that every sort of Spider-Man interpretation had to after that, which was fan expectation. When they delivered the first one, they weren't competing against anything. He was able to basically try what he wanted to do and put his purest vision out there. And from the minute that first movie took off, then they were facing this, again, good problem to have, but these fans were coming to the next few movies with ideas of what they wanted to see and how they thought it was going to play out. And it was, David Koepp put his screenplay on his own website. So you can download it and read through it if you want to, and you'll find a bunch of the elements that Raimi didn't include, but that ended up becoming pretty significant for the reboot, the Mark Webb Amazing Spider-Man movie, primarily the idea of the parents, and that the parents had a relationship with the scientist who would go on to use some of the tech and the education that the Parkers had to birth his own powers. Now, in David Koepp's, it was Dr. Octopus. They transitioned that over to the Lizard and Risa Founds for the Amazing Spider-Man, but essentially it's Peter comes up with a solution, brings it to the potential villain, and helps him unlock what turns him into that villain. All of that stuff is in David Koepp's screenplay. And so I was always fascinated by these what if possibilities. Like, what if Raimi had taken that script and gone with it into his sequels? Where would we have ended up? What if Raimi had the opportunity to follow up Spider-Man 3 with the version of Spider-Man 4 that he wanted to do and almost reclaim the glory of his first two movies? There are all these possibilities that are like little signposts over the course of the journey that if they happened, they pivot in a totally different direction. And I, as a fan, was always just sort of fascinated by those behind the scenes things. And so over the course of getting interviews for this book, I wanted to talk to all the different people who were kind of involved in those decisions at the molecular level and figure out what really was going on with them and how they felt and why the franchise pivoted in the way that it did.
It's fascinating because even when you talk about the potential Spider-Man 4, you see a lot of the ideas that were out there in terms of who the villain would be with Vulture, playing out over the course of the Tom Holland series. But you see a lot of the ideas that were permeating all around, hitting at one point or another in some fashion. And that's pretty fascinating.
Well, also, too, like there are decisions made by the movies before certain iterations that then affect what they can or don't want to do. Like,
right.
We assume that the Goblin is an essential villain for Spider-Man. But when Tom Holland came around and was inserted into the Marvel Cinematic Universe, one of the standards that was set at Sony was no Osborns. Like, we've tried them. It hasn't, it worked and then it didn't work. So now they've painted themselves into a corner where they have a difficult situation. Like they had to essentially come to No Way Home and use the multiverse to pull in an existing Goblin, because trying to go down that route again with an original storyline might have been so complicated just because of the precedent set by the previous movies. And so, when you step back and think about how decisions made by other filmmakers affect what you can do now, I just think big picture that type of storytelling is really, really fascinating to me. And remember, when I started sort of putting the book together and researching it, we didn't know what No Way Home was going to be. I was a year ahead of what that movie turned out to be. So the concept of them coming up with a movie that allowed them to pull the other threads of the Raimi and the Mark Webb movies into the current existing MCU is kind of mind-blowing, because a lot of the conversation of the book is how those franchises have almost shaped and dictated where we are now. But then, of course, Feige figures out a way to merge them all together, and they work in concert with each other, which I think is, again, pretty incredible.
It is pretty incredible. And a lot of that works. The multiverse works, I think, like you said, because of Feige and because of some of the creative juices behind there. But this wasn't the first crack at sort of a multiversal, or I should back up a little bit and introduce this a little bit better. This isn't the first crack at trying to break open Spider-Man's world. And Sony at one point with The Amazing Spider-Man 2 had really tried to lay the groundwork for a cinematic Spider-Man universe, which is similar to what we're seeing them do today. And so the inclusion of a lot of the different villains, and I forgot BJ Novak. When I was reading that, I forgot that he was in that film. It's really funny. But there were a lot of potential villains. It was meant to sort of be that launching off point to build additional films and lay the groundwork for what was to come. Part of that is the Shailene Woodley inclusion that ultimately was cut because there was just so much going on there. But today we see that Sony is seeing some success with that, right? They're branching out. They're bringing Kraven the Hunter to the big screen. They're doing Madam Web. They're launching series in partnership with Amazon Studios. Mm-hmm. Based on your research and kind of living in the world of Spider-Man, what do you think Sony learned from that experience with Amazing Spider-Man 2 and the failure to launch there that's helping them today?
I think they learned that you can't rush it 100%. You can't put the cart as far before the horse as they did with Amazing Spider-Man 2. I think then with Amazing Spider-Man 2, they were arrogant is the wrong word. It's a little bit too strong. But they believed that if they put anything out there with Spider-Man in it, it was going to overperform, essentially. And there was no reason for them not to believe that. I guess as critically panned and as divisive from the fan base that Spider-Man 3, that Raimi Spider-Man 3 is, I think it's before the Marvel ones was the most, box office successful. It was the highest grossing film in the franchise. So you could point to the different reasons why fans didn't think it worked, but the studio looked at it and said, whatever we're doing, it's working. So they felt confident moving forward. That was at a time, and it almost goes into a little bit what I wrote about in the Snyder Cut book too, which is that, DC and Sony at that point were just doing everything that they could to catch up with what they thought Marvel had, which was this universe with so much going on and interconnected stories. And as Amazing Spider-Man 2 was coming out towards theaters and hadn't yet been seen, they had already given dates to Amazing Spider-Man 3 and 4, and Drew Goddard was working on a Sinister Six movie, and they were just, this is our 10-year plan, and those 10-year plans they tend not to work. They tend not to work. And so I think Sony has realized that and learned that. And so now they're slowly building the universe through individual movies for characters that it's weird because you don't know if they're going to hit, and Venom will make a lot of money, and more money than Sony probably expected. And then Morbius brings them back down to earth. Now, if Kraven is a really good movie, that could take off again and sort of prove that their strategy and method forward is working. But I still can't see how that universe of movies works unless it has some type of Spider-Man that's pulling it all together. I think they're eventually going to have to figure out what they're going to do. And I know there have been rumors of maybe we put Andrew in there as the Spider-Man of that universe. I've heard talk about potentially bringing Miles Morales into that universe and making him the Spider-Man that bonds those villains together. But, Sony, I think they learned their lesson in terms of rushing into world building. But then you see something like the end credit scene for Morbius where, they shoehorn in Michael Keaton and you're like, okay, but did you guys really learn what your lesson is? Maybe, maybe you have to figure out ways for these things to organically crisscross, and you can't just put, two characters together and say like, oh, now we're working towards a Sinister Six, because you learned earlier that that's not how you do it.
Yeah, and it's also interesting because they're seeing success in a different type of film as well with Spider-Man, with the Into the Spider-Verse now series that's planned. And you go into that a little bit, talking about how this was really the first major character to have both an animated film release as well as a regular film release around the same time.
Sure.
And so the Miles Morales piece of that is really interesting if you're thinking about potentially the transition from the animated to, real life. I wonder if Miles Morales is kind of the glue that holds that all together, and if that will be strong enough for the Spider-Man faithful to continue going to see these films. Because you hit it on the head. The thing with Spider-Man 3 was that, yes, it was critically panned, but it made a lot of money. And Venom and Let There Be Carnage they're in the same boat. But then you have Morbius that kind of, even though they re-released it, still didn't do very well. So it's interesting. Do you have any opinions on where you think they're going to go with the Spider-Man, sort of that one that binds their universe together?
I'm really split between. I would have leaned towards Andrew coming back. I would have leaned towards Garfield becoming the Spider-Man of that universe, because I really do think that he enjoys playing the character, and I think that he, while he was able to get closure in No Way Home, and you can say that movie kind of operated as a way to let him go off on a high note, you could also view it as a way that like it whet his appetite for more stories in that universe, and I think fans would be very happy for him to come back. But the more practical way forward would be Miles, and it's not just the animated movie, which is again very popular, but it's the video games. The video games are huge right now. They're enormous successes for Sony, for the video platforms, and that's newest one structured around Miles, and then this newest one that's coming up too, that's going to be, they rotate both Spider-Men in there. But one of the things that I've been talking about a lot while going out around and promoting this book is just how much, in doing the research, we're old heads, our Peter Parker is always going to be Spider-Man, and that's our mindset. But like this new generation that's coming up that are, adoring Spider-Man for different reasons, it is Miles. It's Miles who is their Spider-Man, and they view him that way. And there's been so many other iterations in terms of like Spider-Gwen, and the different, even Spider-Man 2099. Like, it's not just limited to Peter anymore. And you could do a live action Miles, I believe, and it wouldn't be nearly as drastic of a transition as maybe we might have believed 5 years ago.
Yeah. With as fast as Sony moves, I'm surprised that we haven't seen or heard of a greenlit Miles Morales film on its way.
No, I know. So, and the TV stuff that you brought up is really interesting, because that could be a way for you to introduce a new character, but you have to assume that the fans are going to watch it, because that's always the risk. Star Wars is kind of going through that right now, where they're introducing some legacy characters through their Disney Plus series, and then spinning off of characters we've met, but like the Andor series, building up that backstory of that character. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But I imagine like a 5-part sort of Miles Morales, limited series that really establishes a background before you then catapult them into that Sony universe. As long as the fans are following it, it could be a great way to introduce them without having to bother doing it, all in your 2-hour window of a feature film.
Yeah, that would be really interesting. So turning back to Tobey Maguire, Andrew Garfield, we saw Tobey as the web crawler in 3 films. We saw Andrew in 2. We've now seen Tom Holland as the web crawler in 6, I believe, if you're counting Captain America, Civil War, Infinity War, and Endgame, with potentially and theoretically many more to come. Why do you think Tom has the staying power that the previous ones did not?
Well, he plugged into a machine that was working. He got introduced in a Marvel sequel that was already highly anticipated. And just by being able to add him, elevated it that much higher. But when you think about the things that had to happen in Captain America Civil War, they introduced Black Panther and the nation of Wakanda. They had the conflict that was central to the comic books between Captain America and Iron Man. Like, there's a lot going on. Even if you remove Spider-Man out of it, and I don't advise that they do, it's still an exciting sequel that works on its own. And we talk about this a lot in the book. All the decisions that were being made about Tom's character was, how do we not repeat what had happened before, but how do we also really take the big picture approach to this is a Spider-Man that's joining a universe where these heroes exist. You know, how is that going to change him? And I know a lot of people kind of nitpick the Iron Man relationship and how turning Tony into his mentor changes a little bit of the Uncle Ben dynamic, and I understand that. But putting Tom into that working machine essentially, and allowing him to sort of grow and be part of those big picture stories like the Avengers movies that we talked about, and also have his individual ones, is part of the reason for success. But also just, and I talk about this in the book when I write about when they were casting him, like Kevin Feige's mandate for the MCU Peter Parker was young. We want to see him as young as possible. It's not a knock on the other guys, but like, you know, in all honesty, they were, you know, cast in their late 20s. By the time they got around to the sequel, they were into their 30s. When you go back and rewatch Tom Holland, you know, in Captain America Civil War, like he is this fresh-faced, you know,
he's a kid.
Yeah, he's a kid. And that was the mandate. And so I think giving him the chance to sort of grow and evolve and have legitimate high school problems, you know, and these first loves, and not that they didn't resonate in the other movies, and honestly, I think the best part of the Mark Webb films is the Emma Stone, Andrew Garfield chemistry, but it made him more relatable, I felt, to the modern audience than potentially Tobey and Andrew were at the time that their movies came out.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And you reference at one point in this book, and I might get the quote wrong, but essentially Stan Lee had said that he imagined a Tom Holland type when he was writing the character, originally creating the character. Mm-hmm. So that goes a long way.
And he joked, like, when they cast Tobey Maguire, you know, Stan was like, oh, you know, that's not who I envisioned at all, kind of thing. But then quickly said, like, once he saw the finished product, he was like, oh, no, I totally get what you're talking about. And it's Amy Pascal, who's been a producer on these movies for the longest time, who she's the one who believes that, like, you have to get Peter Parker right. If you don't get Peter Parker right, and if the people aren't invested in the person who's under the mask, because the action sequences tend to speak for themselves. Sure. But if you don't get that Peter Parker person right, then the movie is not going to work. And I think Tom's terrific in the part. I honestly do. I love him as Peter, and I think that he plays off of the other Avengers really, really well. Yeah,
I absolutely agree with that. He's really entertaining. And I grew up with Tobey Maguire. I still remember the fanfare around Spider-Man hitting theaters, and especially when Spider-Man 2 came out, it was such a big deal because it was actually really good.
Yeah.
You know, unheard of there with sequels.
One of the joys of No Way Home also is that seeing the three of them in a scene together really emphasizes how different their approaches to the character was, you know. And you could try to verbalize it as much as you want, but once you see them playing off of each other, you're like, oh yeah, that's exactly what you did. Oh, the cool youth pastor, like, yeah, that kind of is how Tobey played it, you know. And Andrew being able to be, because I think Andrew's the quippiest of them, you know. I think he has a natural sense of humor that matches what we want from Spider-Man. And then Tom trying to lead them all, kind of becoming, you know, Peter 1, and talking about being with the Avengers, like all of those elements really pulled off of their personalities and the personalities that they brought to each of their films in their franchises. And so getting that tone right, I think, goes a long way to not just the actors, but then to John Watts, who probably doesn't get enough credit for pulling that all together.
Yeah, absolutely. Is it Garfield in the film where he's like Spidey 3 or Spider-Man 3 or something like that? Just that facial expression from him.
Best line deliveries in any Spider-Man movie. Peter 1, Peter 2, Peter 3.
That is great. So aside from, you know, the films and now Tom Holland being synonymous with Spider-Man, the character itself, you talk about this a little bit in the book, but why do you think Spider-Man's popularity has continued as long as it has, to the point where they've been able to reinvent the film series now 3 times?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, even in writing this book and researching it, I'm not quite sure I fully grasp it. There's just something about him. There's something primal about, you know, the way that he looks as a character, moves as a character. To me, like, everyone's going to find an entranceway into him. To me, it's his sense of humor. You know, I think that I love that he has that sarcastic nature about him, that sort of shield of armor that he puts over him. There are different reasons why all sorts of heroes have staying power. Like, why do we keep coming back to Batman films? How come everybody wants Superman films to get back to the place where they were? With Spider-Man, I think it's a couple different factors. I think the humor is a big thing. I think making him young is always a really good thing. I think the fact that he defends a city that we can recognize and go to visit is really important. You know, like Raimi went to great lengths to shoot practically in New York and to make it feel like a New York that it's a little stylized when you go back and take a look at it right now. But it feels like New York. And I think Homecoming also goes back and gets a lot of that. When you see bits of Spider-Man going around and doing little things for people, you know, at a street level, those are parts that are always integral to that character. And I think make him feel like someone we know at the very least. Like if it's not us, you at least recognize like, oh, I know who that kid is. I know that kid at school who's doing this, that, or the other thing. And that relatability about him, I think, is what really keeps him relevant. And when they moved to another character like Miles, they didn't lose that. They kept that core. You know, they just tweaked it. They came at it from a different angle, but never really lost track of the fact that this has to be a kid that you know, that you recognize and isn't. Amy Pascal had a great quote that's in the book where it's like, he's not born a wizard the way Harry Potter was. He's not a Jedi, the way that Luke Skywalker was. He's just a kid who happened to get bit by this spider and now has to handle these powers that he's been given and wants them to go away so many times, like doesn't want them and the burden that comes with it. But it's just too good of a kid to not act on them.
Which is a great struggle that we've seen play out most recently in No Way Home as well. Just, that burden of being Spider-Man is such an interesting exploration that I enjoy each of the series did in their own way. We have a lot of Spider-Man films out there, Sean, but on the record, what's your favorite?
Come on. That's impossible. I will go with, legitimately No Way Home and Into the Spider-Verse are neck and neck my favorites, just because of they're both impossible stories. They shouldn't work as well as they do, Spider-Man 2 is fantastic. It's a traditional sequel. It took what worked about the first one. It ups the game a little bit, but it does it really, really well, like so well, better than most sequels do. But a movie like No Way Home, and I have a poster of it over my shoulder for people who are watching, it just shouldn't exist. There's no way that movie should exist. To take, different Spider-Man from different generations, like first off, those franchises have to be established. And then the actors have to want to come back. Like Andrew has a really funny line where he was like, once Toby said yes, I had no choice. I have to come back at that point. And then, when you factor in COVID, and how difficult it made it to shoot that movie, it shouldn't work. It just shouldn't work. Yeah. And it does, and it's great. But I love the animation in Into the Spider-Verse is spectacular. The different ways that he's interpreted is spectacular. So those two are neck and neck. But I'll pick No Way Home, but they're neck and neck.
Into the Spider-Verse was such a neat experience because I admittedly wasn't following it as closely as I probably should have at the time and wasn't as excited about it as I probably should have been. But in hindsight, oh my gosh, I remember walking out of that theater and just being blown away by the animation itself and the storytelling and the music. The music was phenomenal as well.
It's incredible. But it's I believe Stan had passed away right before that came out, if I'm doing the math correct. So he shows up in his cameo and gives Miles his costume, and I just started crying. I just started crying in the theater, and I was like, that is like one of the most emotional beats. I'm gonna remember that scene and the first time seeing it for a really, really long time.
Yeah, it's so many special moments with this series, the character in general, I should say. Sean, before we wrap up, we mentioned this earlier. Last time we spoke, you were getting the itch to write another book. Do you have the itch for another book now? And if so, what are you thinking?
Yeah, no, I'm into the third book already, and it's
of course you are.
It's due to the publishers in June of 2023. I have no clue when it's going to come out at this point, but it's called Unbreakable, and it's Bruce Willis's legacy on film. And I had been sort of entertaining the idea of doing something outside of the comic book realm after doing Snyder Cut and Spider-Man back to back. I love Bruce. Before the Marvel movies came around, my favorite movie of all time, my answer was always the first Die Hard. I've been fascinated a little bit about how Bruce has been able to transition to a lot of different genres. And while he gets lumped into the Stallone and Schwarzenegger camp, and especially with their Planet Hollywood partnership, I think he has more versatility than those guys ever did, and he can do movies that you would never see Stallone or Schwarzenegger in, whether it be like Death Becomes Her, or some of the sci-fi stuff that he's able to do, or of course Sixth Sense. Like, imagine Schwarzenegger trying to do the Sixth Sense. So Bruce is, of course, one of our most famous movie stars, but I just don't think he gets enough credit for what he does as an actor and the way that he gets behind young filmmakers. People like Quentin Tarantino at a time when he was trying to get Pulp Fiction made, or Rian Johnson with Looper and all these films. And so when Bruce announced his retirement, I thought, all right, well, there it is. That's the catalyst. I need to sort of put that shape this story together and see if I can figure out exactly what his legacy and impact to the film industry is going to be. So I'm in the midst of hammering away at that one right now.
That's great. It's such a great topic too, because he has such a long history. The Fifth Element is by far, you mentioned sci-fi. Fifth Element does it for me every time. I love that movie.
I mean, and so that's what I'm kind of doing, is I'm taking the different genres that he has done. I started with his comedies. I do his science fiction, because you can do 12 Monkeys, you can do Armageddon, you can do Fifth Element. You just forget the number of films that he's been involved in. And he gets lumped into this action hero kind of thing. And that is definitely a component of his filmography. But he works with auteurs. He's done stuff with Wes Anderson, Robert Rodriguez, and getting Sin City off the ground. Like he's not afraid to go outside of his comfort zone. He often pushes himself outside of his comfort zone. And I want him to get the credit for that I think he deserves.
Yeah, such a unique actor there. And I'm going to forget the name here, but I was talking to a filmmaker within the past 6 months about one of the films that I think went straight to VOD, but it was Bruce Willis was in it. And he couldn't say enough good things about how Bruce is just very supportive, as you said, of young filmmakers and their visions and wanting to do whatever he can to contribute, which is why we saw a lot of these smaller projects from him throughout his career. But just that's great to hear, paying it forward that way. Yeah,
absolutely. And, and I also wanted to do something. The first 2 books were so interview dependent and heavy from that perspective of me needing to get to talk to a lot of different people who were involved in the early process. I'm going into this book as doing a lot more critical analysis and sort of going over each of the different movies, but then kind of talking in a big picture of how they fit into not just his career, but the industry as a whole. And not, I don't think I'm ever going to get a chance to speak to Bruce. I think he's so far off the radar at this point that he wouldn't really sit down for an interview. But that's okay. I didn't want this book to have to be dependent on getting him to sit down for sure. If I'm lucky enough to get some time with some of the filmmakers who have worked with him, I've already at this point spoken to Rian Johnson and Quentin and M. Night about their collaborations with him, so I can factor some of that stuff in. But I really want it to be a lot of critical analysis and just going over his body of work. So
that's great, Sean. And listen, the first 2 books are such great reads. I can't wait to read something outside the comic book realm, and especially about another passion project for you, it sounds like, when it comes to Bruce Willis's career. Hey, I want to thank you. Yeah, and thank you for taking the time to talk about this book. It's available everywhere right now with great power. Such an enthralling read. And it makes me want to go watch all of the Spider-Man movies again. I was just thinking recently, I want to watch The Amazing Spider-Man again, because that's the one I probably don't recall the best. Right. Because I think I was a little lukewarm on it. But I definitely want to check that series out again. But thanks for all you do with that, and continue putting out such great content there.
I appreciate you having me on. I'll be back anytime.
Absolutely. We'll talk to you soon, Sean.
The Guy at the Movies podcast is a joint venture between Math Teacher Movies and Guy at the Movies. You can catch new episodes weekly right here wherever you're listening to this one. Subscribe so you never miss a beat.